At 17, Nina Walker had everything going for her. She was bright, driven, and determined. With her eyes set firmly on UCLA, Nina had already been accepted into their prestigious pre-law program, and the future seemed wide open. Her teachers admired her sharp intellect, and her track coach often described her as unstoppable. Her parents, both educators themselves, couldn't have been prouder of their daughter's achievements. They were the kind of parents who believed in hard work and a good education, and they had invested everything into supporting Nina's dreams. This Saturday was supposed to be like any other. A trip to the mall to buy a new backpack for finals, a simple task on her to-do list. Nina's old backpack had finally given out, and with finals just 2 weeks away, she needed a new one. She headed to Budget Mart, a no-frills store not far from her house in Tempe, Arizona. It wasn't the fanciest place in the world, but it was close, cheap, and had everything she needed. As she entered, the store was buzzing with activity, kids running between aisles, a cashier shouting for a price check on a toy, and an overwhelming sense of chaos. The store was busy, but Nina had been in places like this before. She knew what to expect. The backpack she found was simple, a navy blue one, just the right size. While she waited in line to pay, Nina pulled out her phone to scroll through her messages. It was nothing unusual, just checking in with friends and going over some study notes. She was focused on getting the backpack, and after that, she'd head back home to study for finals. But that's when things took a turn. The store manager, a man in a red polo shirt, tapped Nina on the shoulder. He introduced himself as Jeff Reynolds and asked her to follow him to the back of the store. Nina, confused, asked why. The manager didn't explain at first, but insisted she needed to come with him. When she asked again, he told her that someone had reported her for slipping merchandise into her bag. Nina froze, her mind racing. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't even touched anything other than the backpack she was buying. As they walked through the store, Nina could feel the eyes of other customers on her, some watching with suspicion, some simply curious. It was a familiar feeling, but one she never thought she'd experience in a place like this. Nina had always been taught to stay out of trouble, to work hard, to excel. How could this be happening to her? Her heart raced as she was led past the aisles, knowing she hadn't done anything wrong, but unable to shake the feeling that she was already being judged. In the back office, the manager told her to empty her pockets and backpack. Nina's hands trembled as she slowly pulled out her phone, wallet, lip balm, and the navy blue backpack she was planning to buy, still with the security tag attached. Jeff looked at her as if he were expecting something to fall out, as if he wanted to catch her in the act. But all that came out was the simple, everyday stuff of her life. He looked disappointed, almost frustrated, that he didn't have anything to prove she was guilty. "I have no choice but to call the police," he said flatly. "It's company policy." Nina's mind raced. She tried to explain again, but the words didn't seem to matter. She hadn't stolen anything. Why didn't they understand that? But Jeff was unmoved. The police arrived shortly, and the officer who greeted Nina was polite at first, apologizing as he cuffed her and explained he had to follow procedure. But it didn't make the situation any less real. Nina was led to the back of the police cruiser, feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like her, someone who had always played by the rules. At the precinct, things didn't get any better. Nina was booked for petty theft. She repeated over and over that it was a mistake, but no one seemed to care. No one listened. Her lawyer would later tell her that it was just procedure, that it was a minor thing that would be sorted out soon. But in that moment, Nina felt like she was trapped, her whole life turned upside down by an ugly misunderstanding. She was given a court date and sent home, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs, her mind racing. That night, Nina lay in bed, quietly crying into her pillow so her parents wouldn't hear. She couldn't stop thinking about how this could ruin everything. The future she had worked so hard for, the scholarship to UCLA, the dream she had spent years building. All of it felt like it was slipping away, and she couldn't make it stop. The court date arrived faster than Nina could have imagined. The whole week leading up to it felt like a blur of restless nights and endless worry. She barely ate, barely spoke to her parents. Everything felt surreal. She didn't even know where to begin, how to prepare for the day that would determine so much of her future. She had tried so hard to stay strong, to maintain her focus on what lay ahead, but it was harder than she ever expected. Her parents had hired a local attorney, Mr. Paul Halverson, a small-time lawyer who didn't seem particularly invested in Nina's case. He had reassured her that things like this were usually resolved with a simple explanation, that the store would probably drop the charges once they realized it was all just a mistake. But as the day drew closer, Nina started to feel like her lawyer was just saying whatever he thought would calm her down. Walking into the Maricopa County Courthouse, Nina felt the weight of the building itself press down on her shoulders. The sheer size of the place was intimidating, and the cold, sterile atmosphere of the waiting room made her feel small and insignificant. As she sat there clutching her folder of spotless report cards and character references, things she had worked so hard to build, Nina could sense that none of it would matter in this room. None of it would stop the tidal wave of suspicion that had already been cast upon her. Judge Stephen Miller, a man with graying hair and a sharp jaw, took his seat at the front of the courtroom. The moment Nina's name was called, she felt her stomach drop. Her knees went weak, and she stood shakily, trying to hold her head high. But the minute she walked into the room, she felt the temperature shift. All eyes were on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already guilty in the eyes of everyone present. Judge Miller barely looked at her as he scanned the arrest report in front of him. His eyes flicked between the papers, and then, without looking up, he muttered a few words of instruction. His expression was one of boredom, not concern. He didn't ask about the store's security footage, the evidence that could prove Nina's innocence. He didn't request a thorough review of the facts. Instead, he simply announced that the evidence, based on the police report, was sufficient for probable cause to charge Nina with felony theft and scheduled a preliminary hearing for 2 weeks later. Felony. The word echoed in Nina's mind, like a drumbeat she couldn't escape. Her heart raced, and she tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it felt like the room was closing in on her. Everything she had worked for, the scholarships, the academic achievements, the future she had dreamed of, was now on the line because of one ugly misunderstanding. She had to fight, she realized. But in the moment, all she could do was sit in stunned silence. Her lawyer, Mr. Halverson, didn't say anything to object. He didn't stand up for her or try to explain why she shouldn't be charged with a felony. He simply nodded as the judge moved forward, dismissing the situation without a second thought. Nina could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. She couldn't show weakness, not now, but the weight of the injustice was so heavy, and she was so desperate to be heard. As she sat back down, her mind raced. Who could help her? Who could she turn to that might actually believe her? For the first time, Nina thought of Roman, her older brother. He had the power, the influence, the connections to make a difference in this courtroom. She had heard him talk about his position in Washington, D.C., the way his name carried weight, but calling him was no small thing. It wasn't just a phone call, it was a bombshell. It meant throwing a grenade into a situation that was already tense and complicated. Still, Nina knew that if she didn't do something, this nightmare would continue, and there might be no coming back from it. The days leading up to the next hearing were a blur of anxiety, sleepless nights, and constant dread. Nina tried to focus on school, but it was hard to concentrate when every minute felt like it was ticking away in a race against time. Each day, her worries grew heavier, and she could feel herself slipping further from the person she once was, the confident, determined girl with a plan. Now she was just a girl facing a broken system, one that seemed intent on swallowing her whole. Her parents were struggling too. Her mother kept whispering quiet prayers under her breath, glancing at Nina with that worried, helpless look in her eyes. Her father had become distant, retreating into his own world of quiet frustration. They tried to reassure Nina, but the unease in their voices was unmistakable. They didn't have the power to fix this, and neither did she. That night after the hearing, when the weight of everything became too much to bear, Nina took out her phone. She stared at the screen for a long moment before finally dialing her brother Roman's number. Roman Porter, Nina's older brother, had always been a rock. A man who had built a career for himself as a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., he was everything Nina had always hoped to be: sharp, driven, and unyielding in the pursuit of justice. He had a reputation not just for being an incredible lawyer, but for his influence and connections. He could make things happen. But Nina had never asked him for help before. It felt wrong to bring him into this, to drag him into something that should have been a minor misunderstanding. The phone rang, and when Roman picked up, she could hear the calm authority in his voice. "Nina? What's going on?" Her breath caught in her throat, and she hesitated. She didn't want to seem desperate, but she was. "Roman, it's bad. It's worse than I thought." She explained everything to him. The wrongful accusation, the judge, the lack of evidence, the felony charge. And when she finished, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I'll be there," Roman said after a moment, his voice steady. "Don't worry, I'm watching everything. If it gets worse, I'll step in." Nina's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped for reassurance, but hearing her brother's words made her feel both relieved and fearful at the same time. Calling him wasn't just a simple request. It was a declaration of war. It meant throwing a grenade into an already volatile situation. The next morning, Nina felt the weight of the decision. She had asked her brother to intervene, and now it was up to him. She tried to focus on her schoolwork, but her mind kept drifting to what Roman could do. The thought that he might be able to change everything, to expose the truth, made her feel slightly hopeful, but that hope was tempered with fear. She knew how powerful people could be in a courtroom, especially when they had the power to twist the system in their favor. Back in Washington, D.C., Roman was already making moves. His office was sleek, polished, everything in its place. He was a man who commanded respect. As soon as he hung up the phone with Nina, he grabbed his personal phone and began making calls. He didn't waste time with secretaries or scheduling assistants. Roman had been through this before. When something mattered, he didn't let bureaucracy slow him down. He dialed Caleb Rock, a trusted friend and assistant U.S. attorney in Phoenix, Arizona, who had been with him through countless legal battles. Caleb picked up after the second ring. "Caleb, I need you in Tempe right now," Roman said, his voice tight with urgency. "There's a judge down there railroading my sister. Get eyes on her courtroom, before the hour's out." Caleb didn't hesitate. "On it." Roman didn't hang up just yet. He needed more. "Find me everything you can on Judge Stephen Miller. Every decision, every complaint, every little thing that's been swept under the rug." When Roman ended the call, he looked out his office window at the Capitol Dome. He knew this wouldn't be just a simple legal fight anymore. If what Nina was saying was true, this wasn't a case of a simple misunderstanding. Something much uglier was happening in that courthouse, and it had to stop. Back in Tempe, Nina sat with her parents in the courthouse cafeteria, the sterile lights above flickering as they sat in silence. They hadn't touched their food. Her mother clutched a plastic cup of water like it might break if she moved too fast, and her father sat with his hands in his lap, not looking at anyone. He spoke first, his voice low and broken. "We'll get through this, Nina. I'll make some calls, I'll do whatever it takes." But Nina's mind was elsewhere. She pulled out her phone and read Roman's text. "Stay put. Don't sign anything. I'm making some calls." Her stomach dropped. This was it. Things were about to change, but she didn't know how. She showed the message to her attorney, Mr. Paul Halverson, who frowned but nodded stiffly. He didn't argue. Whatever he thought about taking orders from a U.S. attorney, he didn't dare challenge Roman's influence. 20 minutes later, a tall man in a navy suit walked into the cafeteria. His sharp haircut and serious eyes stood out, and Nina didn't need an introduction. She knew who he was. "Miss Walker," he said, his voice steady, professional. He flashed a badge so quickly that it barely registered. "Roman sent me." Nina felt a wave of relief flood her chest. "Caleb Rock," he said as he sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Tell me exactly what happened." The air in the courthouse felt heavy as Nina, her parents, and Mr. Halverson sat in the cafeteria, trying to digest the news Caleb Rock had just shared. The uncertainty of the situation lingered, but there was a new spark of hope in Nina's chest. Roman had pulled the strings, and Caleb was in Tempe now, gathering information, ready to fight for her. She wasn't alone anymore. As they sat there in tense silence, Nina's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Roman. "Stay by the phone. Things are moving fast." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, both comforting and unsettling at the same time. She had asked him for help, and now the wheels were turning. In the courtroom, Judge Stephen Miller sat behind the bench with an air of authority, his black robe hanging loosely on his shoulders. As he entered the courtroom, his gaze flicked over the room, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered to witness the trial. When he saw Nina standing there with her lawyer, her parents anxiously seated behind her, he didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Case number 5739, State of Arizona vs. Nina Walker, he called, his voice like ice. Miss Walker, please stand and enter your plea. Nina stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her, their judgment thick in the air. She tried to steady herself, to breathe through the tightness in her chest. Her whole future rested on this moment. She had been accused of a crime she didn't commit. She had been treated as guilty before she even had the chance to explain herself. But she couldn't let that break her. Not guilty, Your Honor, Nina said, her voice steady, though the words felt like they were being dragged from her. Judge Miller barely acknowledged her, his eyes flicking back down to the case file in front of him. He didn't look at the evidence or ask for any clarification. Instead, he let the moment hang in the air, thick with the weight of a decision already made. The motion to review the surveillance footage is denied, Judge Miller said abruptly, before Nina could even speak another word. The evidence is sufficient for probable cause. We will proceed with the trial. Nina's heart slammed against her ribs. She had hoped that the footage, the clear proof of her innocence, would be reviewed. She had hoped that the truth would finally be enough to set her free. But the judge's refusal to look at the evidence confirmed what she had feared. This wasn't about finding the truth. It was about something else, something much darker. Her lawyer, Mr. Halverson, looked up from his notes, clearly taken aback by the sudden ruling. He opened his mouth to object, but the words never came. Instead, he simply nodded and sat back down, resigned to the fact that Nina's case was already slipping through his fingers. Nina fought to hold back tears, but she couldn't stop the overwhelming sense of helplessness that washed over her. She had done everything right. She had followed the rules, kept her grades up, stayed out of trouble, but in that moment, none of that mattered. She was just another young black woman being treated like a criminal by a system that had already decided her fate. As Nina sat back down, her thoughts began to race. This wasn't just a simple case. This wasn't just about a backpack. This was about something deeper, something systemic. She was a part of a long history of black individuals being wrongfully accused and treated unfairly by a justice system that wasn't built to protect them. This was bigger than her, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to fight. Nina felt a surge of anger. She wasn't going to let them take everything from her. She wasn't going to let them label her as a criminal just because of the color of her skin. She had to stand up. She had to make them see her. But how? As the trial continued, the prosecutor, a young woman named Hannah Lawson, stood up and addressed the court. She wore a smug smile that Nina found hard to ignore, and she seemed so sure of herself, so certain that Nina was guilty. Your Honor, we have enough evidence to move forward with the felony charge. Based on the police report and the witness statements, we are confident that the defendant stole merchandise from the store. We request that the charges be elevated to felony grand theft, she said, flipping through her notes with exaggerated care. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Nina's heart skipped a beat. Grand theft. Felony. Her lawyer jumped to his feet, his voice rising in protest. Your Honor, that's absurd. The value of the merchandise is well below the threshold for grand theft. This is a petty theft case at best. Judge Miller didn't even flinch. He nodded curtly, his face emotionless. The charges will be amended to felony grand theft. A jury will decide. Nina's world seemed to collapse in on itself. The courtroom, which had felt so cold before, now felt suffocating. She looked to her parents, sitting quietly behind her. Her father had his fist clenched tight on his knees, his face set in a grimace. Her mother's hand was pressed firmly against her mouth, as if holding back a scream. The prosecutor's words echoed in Nina's mind. Felony grand theft. The whole world was changing in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Outside the courtroom, Roman's voice echoed in her mind. Stay calm. I'm watching everything. She had never felt more alone than she did in that moment. The world seemed to be moving forward with its decision, and she had no power to stop it. But Roman had promised he would step in when things got bad. And it was bad now, worse than Nina had ever imagined. Outside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Nina stood there with her parents, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air. The charges had been elevated to felony grand theft. Her life, her future, her dreams, everything felt at risk now. The hope she had clung to, that the truth would set her free, was fading fast. She was trapped in a system that refused to acknowledge her innocence, and the path ahead was dark. But that's when it happened. Nina's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down at the message. It was from Roman. "Stay there. Don't sign anything. I'm making calls." Her heart skipped a beat. Roman was on his way. His influence had started to move things already. As Nina stood there, her parents whispering in hushed voices about bail, about loans, about anything they could do to keep her free, the door to the courthouse cafeteria swung open. A tall man in a navy suit stepped inside. He had a sharp haircut, a no-nonsense expression, and eyes that scanned the room with professional ease. Nina's pulse quickened. "Miss Walker?" he said, his voice steady but commanding. He flashed a badge so quickly that Nina barely had time to process it. "Caleb Rock. Roman sent me." Nina felt a wave of relief crash over her, almost knocking the air from her lungs. Caleb Rock. She knew immediately who he was. He was Roman's colleague, an assistant U.S. attorney who had the power to change everything. The surge of hope she felt was unlike anything she had experienced in weeks. Caleb sat down without waiting for an invitation, pulling out a notepad. "Tell me exactly what happened. No skipping details," he instructed. Nina poured out everything. The wrongful accusation, the store manager's behavior, the police, the judge's indifference, and the prosecutor's decision to elevate the charges. Her parents added their own perspectives, their voices thick with anger and fear. Caleb listened intently, writing down every word. He didn't interrupt. He just took it all in. When Nina finished, Caleb sat back, tapping his pen against his notepad. "All right, here's what's happening," he said. "Roman's pulling Judge Miller's record as we speak. Meanwhile, I'm going to file an emergency motion to demand the surveillance footage be submitted before trial. That'll buy us some time." Nina swallowed hard. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb met her gaze, his expression fierce but gentle. "It'll work," he said with conviction. "We're not leaving you out here alone." For the first time in days, Nina felt a flicker of hope. As Caleb quickly made calls and coordinated with his team, Nina realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her brother, she had Caleb, and now they were fighting on her behalf. As Caleb left the cafeteria to file the motion, the clock seemed to speed up. The next few hours passed in a blur. Nina barely had time to process everything that was happening. And then, just as the day was about to end, Caleb returned. "We've got her scared," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "Roman's faster than I thought. Judge Miller has a history." "What kind of history?" Nina's mom asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Caleb stood up, buttoning his jacket. "The kind that's going to make headlines," he replied. Nina felt her heart race. The thought that they were about to expose something bigger than her case was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had no idea what was coming, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a sense of control. The next day, the atmosphere in the courthouse was completely different. The energy had shifted. News vans lined the street, and reporters swarmed the sidewalk. Caleb had pulled some strings, and suddenly Nina's case was front-page news. The power of Roman's influence and the federal investigation into Judge Miller's past was finally starting to show its effects. Nina sat in the gallery, her hands gripping the bench as she waited for the hearing to begin. Her parents sat beside her, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Roman had arrived earlier that morning, and now he stood in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp as he observed the proceedings. Caleb was at the defense table, prepared to strike. Judge Miller entered the courtroom, his black robes swaying behind him as he took his seat. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The smug confidence he had once exuded had been replaced with a tense, almost anxious air. The courtroom was filled with reporters, all waiting for what would happen next. Caleb stood up, his voice commanding attention. "Your Honor, The defense moves for immediate dismissal based on newly uncovered evidence of systemic judicial misconduct. We have over 32 filed complaints and sealed settlements regarding selective enforcement and suppression of exculpatory evidence in this courtroom. Judge Miller's face tightened. He tried to maintain control, but the evidence that Caleb presented was undeniable. "This is irrelevant to the case at hand," the judge snapped, but Caleb didn't back down. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Caleb said, his voice unwavering, "when a judge's integrity is called into question, nothing else can proceed." Roman stepped forward, breaking all courtroom protocol, his voice echoing through the chamber. "With all due respect, Your Honor, when the integrity of a judge is in question, nothing else matters. We demand justice." The room fell silent. The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. And then, it happened. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down. "Charges dismissed without prejudice." His voice was filled with bitterness, but he knew it was over. The courtroom erupted, not with cheers, but with the buzz of stunned conversation. Nina, her parents, and Caleb exchanged glances, unsure of what to feel: relief, victory, or simply disbelief. As they walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Roman stood in front of the cameras, speaking directly to the nation. "This isn't just Nina's story. It's the story of every young person who's been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them." The media coverage was swift. By noon, Judge Miller's name was trending nationwide. Investigations were launched into his past decisions, and it didn't take long for his history of bias to be exposed. Cases he had handled were reopened, and those wrongfully convicted were released. The system had been forced to reckon with its failings. Back at home, Nina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the past weeks lifted off her shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that her future was still possible. She had stood up. She had fought back. When Roman called her later that evening, he simply said, "You did good, kid." And for the first time, Nina believed him.